The scratch of a fountain pen should not have felt like a blade. But standing in the dim corridor outside the Greenwood State drawing room, Victoria heard every stroke of it, sharp, deliberate, final. She had come early. She had wanted to surprise Brian before the Aldoria Autumn Gala, the night he had promised would be their night. Instead, she stood frozen behind the half-open parlor door, still holding the folder of financial documents she had spent 3 days preparing for him. Estate projections, trade proposals, his name on every page, her mind behind every number. Across the room, Brian sat at the mahogany desk she knew better than her own. Opposite him sat a broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit, and beside that man, a woman in ivory silk. Cecile Hargrove. Everyone in Aldoria knew that name. Old money, older bloodline, a dowry that could resurrect a dynasty from ash. Between them on the desk lay a contract. Victoria's name was not on it. "The arrangement is satisfactory, Mr. Greenwood," Cecile's father said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. "The Hargrove endowment clears your family's debts entirely. In exchange, you marry my daughter, a woman of actual standing." Victoria's fingers tightened around the folder. She waited for Brian to hesitate, to push back his chair, to say her name. He dipped the pen and signed. "Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button, likes, and share, because tomorrow I have more story for you." "And Miss Ashford?" Brian asked, but his voice was flat. Obligatory. The question of a man tying off a loose thread. Cecile did not even look up from adjusting her glove. Give her something for her trouble. Women like her are practical. She'll land on her feet. Women like her. Women who worked in silence so men could shine in public. Women who understood that in Aldoria's drawing rooms, intelligence without a family crest was merely convenient, and convenience could always be replaced. Victoria's chest did not crack. It went very, very still. She turned from the door before they could see her. She would not give this house her tears. She had given it 2 years of her mind, her strategy, her sleepless nights, and that was already far too generous a price. She turned and walked directly into a wall of black wool. 2 hands caught her arms, steadying her with a precision that felt less like reflex and more like intention. Victoria looked up. The man was tall, lean, and dressed in a dark tailcoat so severe it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore no family colors, no decorative chain, no badge of social allegiance. His face was composed and angular, brown hair swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes, dark gray, still as deep water, regarded her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. "Leaving Miss Ashford." His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to compete for a room's attention because rooms simply went quiet when it spoke. "You have the advantage of me," she said, because 2 years of navigating Brian's social world had taught her to answer a question with a question when she needed time to think. "Pedro." He offered nothing else. No house name, no title, just the single word, delivered as though it were entirely sufficient. His gaze moved briefly to the parlor door she had been standing beside, then returned to her face. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the knowledge of one. "I have a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear it." Victoria looked at the folder still in her hands. Brian's name, Brian's future, built entirely from her invisible labor. She set it down on the hall table without ceremony and met the stranger's eyes. "I'm listening," she said. What Victoria did not know, could not have known, standing in that dim corridor with her pride held carefully together like fine porcelain, was that the man before her was not merely a stranger with convenient timing. Pedro Thornfield was the Grand Duke of Aldoria, and he had not stumbled into that corridor by accident. He had been watching her for a very long time. He came at 7 o'clock precisely. Victoria heard the knock from the top of the stairs, 3 measured strikes, neither urgent nor tentative, the knock of a man who had never once wondered whether a door would be opened to him. She had been sitting at her writing desk for the better part of an hour, still dressed in the gown she had worn to Greenwood Estate that morning. The candle burned low beside an untouched cup of tea. She had not cried. She had not eaten. She had simply sat and thought, and let the silence of the townhouse press in around her like something that needed to be felt before it could be moved past. Mrs. Holt, her housekeeper, appeared in the doorway a moment later with an expression of careful neutrality that meant she had already formed a strong opinion about the visitor. "A gentleman, miss. No card." Victoria descended the stairs. He stood in the entrance hall exactly as he had stood in the corridor at Greenwood Estate, entirely still, entirely composed, occupying the space without consuming it. The black tailcoat, the gray eyes, the quality of attention he directed at her that felt less like observation and more like acknowledgement. "You found me quickly," Victoria said. "I knew where you lived before this morning," he replied. It was not said to unsettle her. It was said because it was true, and he appeared to be a man with little patience for the performance of ignorance. "My name is Pedro. I believe we have something to discuss." She showed him to the sitting room. She did not offer tea. He did not expect it. He sat across from her and set a single folded document on the low table between them. He did not push it toward her. He simply left it there, available, the way a man lays down a card when he is confident in his hand. 1 year, he said. A contracted marriage. In that time you will have a name, a household, and a position in Aldoria's social order that no drawing room in this city will be able to dismiss or diminish. At the end of the year, the arrangement concludes on whatever terms suit you best. He paused. "I require a wife for reasons that are my own. You require a foundation. The terms are clean." Victoria looked at the document without touching it. "Why me?" she said. It was not quite a question. Pedro regarded her for a moment with that same expression she had not yet learned to read. Not quite a smile, not quite calculation, something steadier than either. "Because for 2 years," he said, "Aldoria's most capable woman has been made invisible by people who were not fit to read the work she produced. I find that wasteful." He glanced briefly at the document, then back at her. "And I do not waste useful things." Victoria picked up the document. She began to read. He collected her the following morning at 9. No carriage announcement, no footman sent ahead. Simply a knock at the precise hour he had named before leaving the previous night, and when Victoria descended with her coat already buttoned, she caught the faintest shift in his expression. Not quite approval. Something quieter than that. The recognition of a person who does what they say they will do. The carriage ride was largely silent. Victoria did not fill it with conversation, and Pedro did not appear to expect her to. He sat across from her with one hand resting on his knee and his gaze moving occasionally to the window, and she used the time to study him the way she had always studied rooms she was about to enter, cataloging, measuring, preparing. He was younger than she had first assumed. Somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps, though something in his bearing carried the particular gravity of a man who had made consequential decisions early and often. He wore no ring. He carried no obvious emblem of family or house. For a man proposing a marriage contract, he traveled remarkably light. The study he brought her to was on the upper floor of a narrow townhouse in Aldoria's quieter residential quarter, the kind of address that announced wealth through restraint rather than display. Dark bookshelves, a single lamp already lit against the gray morning, and at the center of the room, a mahogany desk. Victoria stopped just inside the doorway. It was the same desk. Not literally, she understood that, but it was the same proportions, the same dark wood, the same green leather surface. The same architecture of authority that Brian had used 2 mornings ago to sign her name out of his future. Her hands, steady until this moment, made a small involuntary movement at her sides. Pedro noticed. Of course he noticed. He said nothing. He simply moved to the side of the desk and set the contract, her copy, the terms she had spent the previous evening reading 3 times through, in the center of the leather surface. Beside it, a pen. He did not sit. He stood with his hands loosely clasped, giving her the desk, the room, and the decision entirely. Victoria crossed to the chair. She sat down. She read through the document one final time with the methodical attention she gave every contract, checking not for surprises, she had already found none, but because the habit of thoroughness was one she had no intention of discarding simply because the circumstances were extraordinary. Then she looked up at him. His expression was exactly what it had been the night before and every moment since, composed, precise, and carrying in its stillness something she cannot fully account for. Not coldness, something more deliberate than coldness. A watchfulness that suggested he was absorbing far more than he would ever volunteer. It unsettled her more than fury ever had. She picked up the pen and signed. The registry office on Aldoria's civic quarter was an unremarkable building. That was precisely why Pedro had chosen it, Victoria suspected. Gray stone, narrow windows, a clerk's counter worn smooth by decades of elbows and paperwork. The kind of place where transactions were completed without ceremony, where the business of living was recorded in ledgers and filed without sentiment. No one of consequence conducted their affairs here, which meant no one of consequence would witness theirs. The clerk was a small, precise man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, the kind of person who had processed 1,000 such appointments and retained the professional disinterest of someone who would process 1,000 more. He accepted their documents without looking up, sorted them into a sequence known only to himself, and began working through the administrative formalities in a brisk, practiced monotone. Victoria answered her questions clearly. She signed where indicated. She kept her gaze forward and her breathing even, the way she had learned to do in rooms where she could not afford to appear uncertain. Then the clerk reached the final page, ran his finger down the column of names to confirm the entry, and looked up for the first time. Not at Victoria, at Pedro. Something shifted in the small man's face, a fractional widening of the eyes, a sudden straightening of the spine, the involuntary recalibration of a person who has just registered something they did not expect to encounter on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Your Grace. The clerk's voice dropped into a register of careful formality, entirely unlike the efficient monotone of the previous 5 minutes. Everything is in order. If you would sign here. He turned the ledger, and his finger indicated the line with a precision that had acquired, in the span of 3 seconds, something approaching reverence. Victoria did not move. Your Grace. She kept her face still through the training of 2 years in rooms where composure was armor, but beneath it something had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a mind rapidly reordering everything it thought it understood. She watched Pedro take the pen. She watched him sign. She watched the clerk blot the ink with the solemnity of a man completing a document he would likely describe to his wife that evening. Pedro Thornfield, Grand Duke of Aldoria. The words sat in the ledger in plain black ink, patient and irrefutable. Victoria looked at the line above it, where her own signature already waited. Victoria Thornfield. The carriage ride back was quiet, as all their carriage rides were quiet. Pedro sat across from her with the same composed stillness he always wore, his gaze moving to the window, one hand resting on his knee. The city moved past the glass in its ordinary afternoon indifference. Victoria said nothing. He did not explain. And somehow, in the architecture of his silence, she understood that he had been waiting, not with guilt, but with patience, to see what she would do with the truth now that she had it. Thornfield Hall announced itself before she could see it. The carriage had been traveling for nearly 20 minutes through Aldoria's northern reaches, where the city's polished facades thinned gradually into older, quieter streets, and the streets gave way to a long road flanked by stone walls and iron-dark trees, standing at attention. Victoria had watched the transition without comment, marking the distance between one world and another the way she marked everything, precisely and without sentimentality. Then the trees parted and the hall appeared. It was vast. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the quality of its vastness, not the swollen, ornamental grandeur of Greenwood Manor, with its gilded cornices and fountains positioned for maximum admiration, but something older and more absolute. Dark stone that had not been dressed up or softened. Tall windows that caught the late afternoon light without vanity. A symmetry so deliberate it felt less like architecture and more like argument, the statement of a house that had nothing to prove and had decided, some centuries ago, to stop pretending otherwise. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Dalton, met them at the entrance with the measured warmth of someone who managed an extraordinary household without ever being overwhelmed by it. She showed Victoria through the principal rooms with quiet efficiency, and Victoria followed, absorbing. The entrance hall, flagstone floors, a single large painting, a landscape, not a portrait. No ancestors posed in chains of office. No display of accumulated consequence. The library, floor to ceiling, every shelf full, and not decoratively full. These were books that had been read. Spines cracked, pages marked. A reading chair position near the east window, at an angle that suggested habitual use, a small table beside it worn at the corner where a cup was set down nightly. The study on the upper floor, which Mrs. Dalton opened only briefly. Maps. An entire wall of them, overlapping, annotated in a hand Victoria was beginning to recognize. Trade routes. Regional boundaries. Names and figures noted in margins with the compressed precision of a man who did not write a word he did not need. Victoria stood in the doorway of that study for slightly longer than was strictly necessary before moving on. At dinner, Pedro sat at the head of the table and spoke to her without social performance, not the careful charm Brian had deployed like a tool, adjusted for each audience, but direct and particular. He asked what she had thought of the library. He noted, without fanfare, that she was welcome to use the East Wing correspondence room if she required a workspace of her own. She looked at him across the candlelight. He was already reading the document beside his plate, pen in hand, entirely unself-conscious about it, a man entirely at home in his own mind, in his own house, making no effort whatsoever to appear otherwise. Victoria reached for her wine and said nothing. But she was beginning, quietly and against her better judgment, to understand him. Lady Pemberton's afternoon receptions were, by long-standing consensus, the most reliably informative event on Aldoria's social calendar. Not because of a hostess, who was pleasant enough in a vague, well-upholstered way, but because of the guests, drawn from every significant house in the city, gathered in a room with excellent acoustics and a shared addiction to consequence. If something had happened in Aldoria, Lady Pemberton's drawing room would have an opinion about it within the week. If something had happened that morning, it would have 3 opinions about it before the second round of tea. Victoria had attended twice before, invisibly, as Brian's quiet companion. She had stood at the room's edges and listened to everything, and no one had thought to lower their voice around her because no one had thought about her at all. She arrived now on Pedro's arm. The effect was not immediate. It moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water, a small disturbance at the center, then rings spreading outward in every direction until the entire surface had shifted. Heads turned. Conversations paused and resumed at a different register. Fans moved with renewed purpose. Lady Pemberton herself crossed the room to greet them with the particular brightness of a hostess who understood she had just become the venue for something people would discuss for months. Victoria kept her posture easy and her expression composed and heard everything. Married 3 days ago, apparently. A Miss Ashford. Does anyone know the family? No title. No fortune to speak of. He must have lost his mind. or found something more interesting than a title. A pause, speculative. She's rather striking, I suppose. I heard she was Greenwood's girl. Can you imagine Brian Greenwood's cast-off, now the Grand Duchess? 2 years of invisibility had given Victoria a finely calibrated instrument for reading rooms. She knew which whispers were merely curious, which were threatened, and which were the kind that hardened into something more permanent if left unanswered. She catalogued them all without moving her gaze from her conversation with Lady Pemberton, who was asking something about Thornfield Hall's rose gardens that Victoria answered with sufficient warmth to be considered gracious. She felt Brian before she saw him. A particular quality of stillness in the far corner of the room, the wrong kind, the stillness of a man exerting significant effort not to react. She turned her head with the unhurried ease of someone merely surveying a pleasant gathering, and found him exactly where the stillness had told her he would be. Brian Greenwood stood beside the fireplace with a glass he had forgotten he was holding, his face arranged into an expression that was attempting composure and achieving something considerably closer to shock. Beside him, Cecile Hargrove said something Victoria could not hear. Brian did not respond. Victoria met his eyes across the room for precisely 2 seconds. Then she looked away, returned her attention to Lady Pemberton, and smiled at something the woman said, as though nothing in the room was more interesting than the conversation directly in front of her. She did not flinch. She had never intended to. She found it on a Thursday, looking for something entirely ordinary. Mrs. Dalton had mentioned a household inventory ledger kept somewhere in the East Wing correspondence room, the workspace Pedro had offered her in that offhand, practical way of his during her first week at Thornfield Hall. Victoria had been using it for her own affairs, the quiet work of reorganizing her personal accounts and correspondence, and had begun to find the room's particular order congenial in the way she found most things at Thornfield congenial, because nothing in it was decorative. Everything had a function, including, she had assumed, the locked door at the corridor's far end that she had noted on her first day and not remarked upon. On Thursday the key was in the lock. Not thrown open, not left carelessly ajar, simply unlocked, as though whoever had been inside last had departed in sufficient thought to forget the final step of securing it. Victoria stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at it. Then she opened the door. The room beyond was larger than she had expected, running the full depth of the east wing, lit by 3 tall windows overlooking the rear grounds. It was like everything at Thornfield, meticulously ordered. But the order here had a different quality, denser, more urgent, the organization of a man managing not a household, but an operation. The walls held shelves of ledgers, each one labeled in Pedro's compressed, angular hand. Below the windows ran a long table covered in documents arranged in careful sequence, held in place with smooth stones used as paperweights. Maps again, as in the upstairs study, but these were annotated differently, not with trade routes, but with names, dates, figures, lines of connection drawn between houses, businesses, government offices, and financial institutions across the breadth of Aldoria. Victoria moved to the nearest shelf and read the spines. House Whitmore, House Carrington, House Alderley, House Pemberton, and there, on the 3rd shelf, filed between 2 others with the same neutral precision as all the rest, House Greenwood. She took it down. She did not read it quickly. She read it the way she read every document that mattered, slowly and completely, and what she found over the following hour was not a simple record of debt or mismanagement. It was a meticulous, evidenced account of deliberate financial manipulation spanning nearly a decade, false declarations, diverted funds, trades conducted on privileged information obtained through corruption. Brian's name appeared throughout, his father's more so. She set the ledger down and stood very still. Pedro had not stumbled into her life at a convenient moment. He had not noticed her by accident, had not chosen her on impulse. He had been building something for years, patient, systematic, invisible, a case against the entire rotten architecture of Aldoria's noble class. And at some point in the course of that work, he had seen her. The man she had agreed to marry as a matter of pragmatic convenience was not a reclusive duke with a manageable problem. He was the most dangerous man in the kingdom, and she was living in his house. The carriage ride back to Thornfield Hall was quiet in a different way than usual. Victoria sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city move past the window, and Pedro sat across from her in his customary stillness, but there was something altered in it tonight, a quality of attention directed at her that she could feel without looking at him directly, the way one feels the heat of a fire without needing to face it. She had not planned to speak first, but the evening was still sitting in her chest, large and unresolved, and she had never been comfortable leaving things unexamined. "You knew he would be there," she said. A pause. "Yes. And you said nothing. I thought you might prefer to walk in without anticipating it." Another pause, shorter than the first. "I was not certain you would want the preparation. It can make a person careful when careless is better." Victoria considered that for a moment. It was, she realized with some irritation, correct. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. In the low light of the moving carriage, his face held its usual composed architecture, but she had been studying him for weeks now, and she had begun to learn the small vocabulary of shifts beneath it, the slight tension at the corner of his jaw when he was thinking beyond the present moment, the way his gaze settled differently when he was simply observing versus when he was actively interested. He was actively interested now. "He thought I would collapse," she said. "He has consistently underestimated the source of his own competence," Pedro replied. "That is a pattern, not an accident. People who take credit for others' work must believe the work was never that remarkable to begin with. Otherwise, the taking becomes something they have to live with." Victoria looked at him. "That is a precise way of describing cowardice. It is a precise thing." The carriage slowed as Thornfield Hall's gates came into view. Victoria turned back the window, and in the dark glass she could see the faint reflection of them both, him watching her watching the road, the space between them on the seat neither as wide as a contract required nor as simple as either of them had originally proposed. She thought about the East Wing, about the ledgers, about the question she had been carrying for 4 days without yet finding the right moment to set down in front of him. She thought about Lord Ashby's table and the silence that had followed her last word, a silence so complete and so sudden that she had felt it physically, like a change in pressure. The loudest sound a room full of powerful people could produce. The sound of a recalibration. She had built that silence herself, without Brian, without anyone to stand in front of her or behind her. Only herself. The carriage stopped. Pedro descended first and offered his hand at the door as he always did, a formality so consistent it had begun, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, to feel like something else. Victoria took his hand and stepped down into the cool night air. Neither of them spoke, but she did not release his hand immediately, and he did not move to withdraw it, and for a moment they simply stood in the lamplight outside Thornfield Hall while the truth of the evening settled around them like the first quiet hour after a long storm. She went to the map room at midnight. Not impulsively. Victoria did very few things impulsively, but after 2 hours of sitting with the question that had been building since the East Wing, since Lord Ashby's table, since the carriage ride home, and the lamplight, and the moment at the door that she had been carefully not thinking about. She had reached the point where continuing not to think about it required more effort than simply walking down the corridor and having the conversation. The map room was lit when she arrived. Pedro was already there. He stood at the long table with his back to the door, studying one of the annotated maps in the focused, unhurried way he studied everything. He did not startle at her entrance. He turned with the ease of a man who had, she suspected, heard her footsteps on the stairs and drawn his own conclusions. "The East Wing," Victoria said. She did not sit down. You left it unlocked. He regarded her steadily. Yes. Deliberately. A pause that was not quite confirmation, and not quite denial, which was itself a kind of answer. She crossed to the near side of the table and faced him across it, and she kept her voice level because the situation warranted levelness, not because she felt it. I want the truth, she said. All of it. Why me? Why then? What you actually needed and what you actually knew before you knocked on my door. Pedro set down the paper in his hand. He did not look away from her, did not reach for the careful social distance most people inserted between themselves and an uncomfortable accounting. He simply looked at her with those steady gray eyes and told her. He had been watching Greenwood's ascent for 3 years as part of his broader investigation into Noble House corruption. Brian's rise had been too consistent, his judgments too sound, his proposals too well-constructed for a man whose private correspondence revealed a middling intelligence and a significant appetite for shortcuts. Something else was producing the work. Pedro had looked for it with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, and he had found her, in the margins of minutes, in the architecture of proposals, in the specific intelligence visible beneath Brian's public performances like a watermark held delight. He had needed, when the time came to move against the corrupt houses, someone who understood the system from the inside. Not an observer, a participant. Someone who knew where the real levers were because they had been operating them invisibly for years. That is what I needed, Pedro said. That is why I came. The room was very quiet, and the rest of it, Victoria said carefully. He was still for a moment, not evasively still. The stillness of a man choosing precision over convenience. The rest of it, he said, I did not anticipate. His gaze held hers with a steadiness that had nothing contractual left in it. I find that I cannot account for it in the terms I originally used, and I thought you should know that. Victoria stood across the table from him in the candlelit map room, surrounded by years of his patient, meticulous, invisible work, and understood that she was looking at a man who was, in this moment, doing something she had rarely seen him do. He was telling her the truth without knowing what she would do with it. She knew exactly how that felt. The Grand Autumn Gala opened, as it always did, with the kind of orchestrated magnificence that Aldoria's nobility used to remind itself of its own importance. Candlelight by the thousand, silk and velvet and the cold glitter of inherited jewels. A ballroom that had witnessed a century of alliances and betrayals dressed up as celebrations, and knew the difference between the two better than most of its occupants. Victoria wore deep burgundy. No family jewels, she had none, but a single strand of dark pearls that Mrs. Dalton had left on her dressing table that morning without explanation. She had put them on and asked no questions. She was learning, gradually, the particular language of Thornfield Hall silences. Pedro had been in quiet motion for 3 days. She had seen enough of the map room's contents to understand what that meant. The evidence he had assembled across years of patient, invisible work had reached the point of deployment, and the gala was the stage he had selected, not for spectacle, but because every significant house in Aldoria would be present, and what was witnessed collectively could not be individually denied. By the time the 3rd hour arrived, Brian Greenwood knew. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders across the ballroom, the way his conversation had grown clipped and his color had risen. 2 men she recognized as senior members of Aldoria's Financial Oversight Council had been in quiet conference with Pedro near the East Colonnade for the better part of an hour. Whatever was being said, Brian understood its direction. He crossed the floor toward her with the momentum of a man who had decided that attack was preferable to collapse. Congratulations are in order, I suppose. His voice carried, deliberately, she noted, for the benefit of the surrounding guests. Though I imagine a practical woman like you knew exactly what she was purchasing when she signed whatever arrangement brought her here. A title for a year. A convenient prop for a duke with political problems. The nearby conversations quieted. Heads turned with the refined subtlety of people who wanted very much to watch without appearing to. Victoria did not look at Pedro. She turned to face the room. 2 years ago, she said, her voice carrying the same clean, unhurried precision she had used at Lord Ashby's table, I drafted every significant proposal that elevated House Greenwood from a failing estate to a respected name in this city. I managed the accounts, restructured the debt, and built the reputation that allowed Brian Greenwood to stand in rooms like this one. She paused. He signed his name to all of it. I signed none of it. And most of you knew the work was good without ever wondering who had actually done it. The ballroom was very still. I am not a purchased accessory, Victoria continued. I am the woman who understood how this world worked from its underside and chose deliberately to step into its center. She held the room's silence for one measured beat. I suggest you adjust accordingly. No one spoke. Brian opened his mouth. Nothing came. She turned away from him with the same finality she had used to close the Greenwood parlor door, not in anger, but in completion, and found Pedro across the crowded ballroom. He was watching her with an expression she had spent 2 months learning to read. She read it now, clearly and completely, for the very first time. It was not strategy. It was not calculation. It was not the composed watchfulness of a man managing a useful arrangement. It was something considerably simpler and considerably more permanent, and he made no effort whatsoever to conceal it. Victoria held his gaze across the candlelit room and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be.